Hello, my name is Jeff Messier. I'm a professor in electrical and software engineering in the Schulich School of Engineering. And the title of this talk is Spreadsheets versus AI, when good enough is actually good enough. And this is a presentation that I'm going to be delivering at the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness 2024 conference. So before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm recording this video in southern Alberta, which is the traditional lands of the Treaty 7 people, including the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Piikani, the Kainai, and the Siksika First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda people, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations as well. These are also the lands of the city of Calgary is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, districts 5 and 6. Districts 5 and 6 now. This slide's a little old. It's no longer Region 3. And I'm grateful to be here. I've grown up in Western Canada. Calgary hasn't always been my home. But I've lived in Calgary now longer than anywhere else, which was kind of shocking to me when I realized that. And this is a very special place, and I'm very grateful to be here. I'm also very grateful for all of the partners that made this work possible. So these are the wonderful agencies that I work with in Calgary in the housing and homelessness space. We work with data under the jurisdiction of the Alberta government, and they're a very welcome and collaborative partner on this work, as well as we've been lucky enough to get financial support, both from the Calgary Health Foundation and from Making the Shift. So, this question or this presentation is all about using data to answer questions. And I now have given quite a few talks on the combination of AI and homelessness, and this is a very natural. So people do ask me about this a lot, which is very natural because artificial intelligence and machine learning basically are methods that allow us to use data to answer questions. And thinking about AI in the homelessness space is very natural because there's a ton of data. So the agencies working in housing and homelessness do record a huge amount of data. And B, they have a huge number of really important questions. There are a lot of really very important to society type questions in the housing and homelessness space. And so it's natural to think about AI, but of course AI is expensive, right? You need, in many cases, fancy infrastructure to run the most advanced artificial intelligence models. You need people with expertise in machine learning and AI, which can also be pretty expensive. And the focus of this talk is to ask the question, if you want to use data to answer questions, do you really need to spend all the money on fancy AI tools and experts, or can you use simpler tools to answer your questions? And spoiler alert, the whole purpose of this presentation is to show you that sometimes simple tools are good enough. And I'm going to, in this talk, sort of go through an example where I show how we can use spreadsheets to identify people who are at risk of becoming long-term shelter users. But the point of this talk is not to convince you to use a spreadsheet to find people who are at risk of long-term shelter use, or you certainly can if you want to. But the big purpose for this talk is to just really encourage people to not be kind of apologetic or reluctant to use simple tools. I hear a lot of people sort of say, oh, we're still using spreadsheets, or oh, we're just using spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are amazing. Microsoft Excel this year turns 40 years old, and it is still such a mainstay in so many different industries. And so the purpose of this talk is to really encourage and validate the use of simple tools, and to also encourage people at agencies to just get involved with your data. You don't necessarily need a fancy expert to do this kind of stuff. If you've got somebody at your agency who maybe doesn't have a formal training necessarily in AI or machine learning, but just kind of likes data, is always sort of mucking around with spreadsheets, you may well have all you need. You've got a data enthusiast, you've got simple but very effective tools, and the purpose of this presentation is to show you that those two things can often be enough. So I watched, I'm recording this in 2024. I watched a lot of Olympics this summer in Paris. Great television, really enjoyed a lot of it. And of course, this is a picture of the very exciting photo finish for the men's 100-meter race. And, this is the picture of winning. This is what winning a gold medal looks like, right? Super fit people at peak performance, just doing their absolute best. And so if we think about, the gold medal solution when it comes to working with data, these days it does involve AI, right? So the very best that AI has to offer really is pretty exciting these days. So, a couple examples. In housing and homelessness, we record a lot of case notes data that's kind of hard to analyze, large amounts of it. And large language models, for example, can be used to go through case notes and spot trends. So, for example, you could use a large language model to spot the case notes that are talking about people that are maybe experiencing challenges related to their mental health. Machine learning models are also really good at sort of combining different types of data together. So machine learning can take survey results, shelter access patterns, maybe even those case notes, combine all of those inputs together to answer a question. And so the very best that AI has to offer, advanced AI technology running on the very best infrastructure, usually is the gold medal solution. That kind of is the best you can do. But do you need the gold medal solution, or would you be perfectly happy with a silver medal? So this is a picture of Yusuf Dikec. I might not be pronouncing his last name properly, but Yusuf is, he's from Turkey, and he won the silver medal in target shooting, and was kind of a sensation because, in a field where people show up with like special ear protection, lenses, all kinds of gadgets, he just kind of rolled in with his regular glasses, some earplugs that looked like they'd been from the university, bought at a university bookstore, and just kind of casually won a silver medal with really not a lot of extra sort of accessories or things to go along. And I really kind of see Yusuf as sort of a powerful metaphor of, he didn't win the gold, but he used simple tools to win the silver, which is still really, really good. And maybe, in a sector where, there's not always a ton of money to splash out on fancy data tools, using simple tools that you already have on hand, that your staff already understands how to do or how to use, is good enough when you're trying to answer your questions. And so the focus of this talk is all about that. So I'm going to sort of go through a case example where I use a spreadsheet to answer a data question that normally people would use, or where people would normally use AI. And spreadsheets can't normally beat AI, but they can sometimes come close enough that maybe you're satisfied with that level of performance and you can save on all the cost of investing in AI. And so what I want to do to sort of set the stage for this talk is I want to basically talk about the 3 steps that you go through whenever you want to use data to answer a question, regardless of whether you're using AI or not. And so the first step is choose the question, right? So you want to choose a really important question to answer. And the reason why it's important to choose a really important question is because even using simple tools, answering your question is going to cost money. It's going to take staff time, and so you want to make sure that you're investing those resources wisely. Step 2, take a look at what kind of data you have on hand. Sometimes people will go around collecting a new data set to answer a question, but ideally you answer your question with data that you've already got available to you, because your staff's already busy enough. Getting them to administer yet one more survey or something like that is not attractive. And then question 3, step 3, once you've got your question, once you're familiar with the data that you have, decide on a way to use that data to answer your question. And this is sort of the point where you say, well, do I use machine learning or do I do something else? Now, which of these 3 steps is most important? Step 1. And this is good news, actually. So, often at housing and homelessness agencies, people are concerned. It's like, oh, well, we don't have the expertise to make use of our data because maybe you don't have like a machine learning person on staff. But it's really important to remember that the most important step in this process is actually choosing the question that you want to have answered. What's the really important question? And to choose an important question, you don't want a data expert, you want an expert in homelessness. And that is exactly your expertise. So if you're running a housing and homelessness agency, your expertise is homelessness and housing. And so you are exactly the person to come up with the most important question to answer. So you've already ticked the most important box. Steps 2 and 3, maybe we use a spreadsheet, maybe we don't, but you always want to be answering the right question. The steps 2 and 3 require kind of a nerdy data person and maybe some computing tools. But as I said, the objective of this talk is to demonstrate that the tools that you need to answer your question and, the nerdy person that is going to be using those tools, both of those things maybe don't need to be as fancy as you originally thought. Okay, so I want to illustrate this idea of using simple tools to analyze data with an example case study. And so the case study that we're going to focus on is identifying people who are at risk of becoming long-term shelter users. So long-term, sometimes the term chronic is used. I don't love that term, but long-term or chronic shelter users are typically a priority for connecting to housing supports because someone's been in shelter for a long time and they're having trouble getting out, so they need special support. However, the most obvious way to spot a long-term shelter user is to wait a long time, but that's a terrible idea because if someone is experiencing their first day in shelter, it's a bad thing to say to that person, well, if you're still here in a year, we might connect you with supports, right? We want people to get out of shelter as soon as possible. And so the question that we're going to use data to answer, and remember there's 3 steps, right? Identify your question, get familiar with your data, and then decide on your methods. So step 1, the question that we're going to answer in this sort of case study example is, can we use data from early on in somebody's shelter stay to see if they are at risk of eventually becoming a long-term shelter user? Step 2, what kind of data do we have to work with? Well, for this case study, I'm going to use a historical data set of shelter check-ins from the Calgary Drop-In Center, which is one of our collaborating agencies. So this is an anonymized data set that we've been working with, and in this historical data set, we have patterns of all kinds of people accessing shelter, and we can sort of look historically and we can see, okay, well, who eventually became a long-term or a chronic shelter user. So now the next step, step 3, is to figure out how to take our data and answer our question, right? And so this is kind of where sort of the secret sauce is, right? And this is where maybe people might immediately jump to using artificial intelligence. But I want to kind of reveal a few, I'm going to call them secrets. They're not really secrets, but they're kind of a few important facts that will hopefully help encourage you to see if you can, as a human, come up with some good ways to take a look at your data. First of all, secret number 1, an AI algorithm often uses data in exactly the same way as a human expert. It's just faster. It's just automatic. It runs on a computer. But the things that an artificial intelligence algorithm will look at are often the same kind of things that you as a human expert would sort of look at when you're looking at data to spot somebody at risk of long-term shelter use. And so the best way to start to think about how to analyze your data is for you as an expert in homelessness to just think in your own head, what are some of the characteristics that we often see in people who become long-term shelter users? So often these people face, mental health and trauma related challenges. These people might maybe not be engaging with support, so they're using shelter, but they're not actively engaging in the supports that are being offered. And they're also around all the time, typically, right? So somebody who is a long-term shelter user often is there sort of every single day. So we've got all these characteristics, and we want to spot these characteristics in the data. We want to come up with a way to spot these characteristics. But it's really important also, and this is secret number 2, when designing a data tool, don't be afraid to start simple. In fact, there's a luminary in artificial intelligence. His name is Andrew Ng. He's been involved in big projects at Google. He's a Stanford computer science professor. And, he gives a really insightful lecture on how to actually use data analysis in the real world. And this is basically his number 1 recommendation. Start with your simplest method first. Only get more complicated if you need to. And so we've got all these characteristics of somebody who might become a long-term shelter user, but we don't have to look for all of them right off the bat, right? Let's maybe look at the easiest one first, and then we'll maybe incorporate these other ones if necessary. And so what we're going to do is we're going to focus on just spotting people who are making very regular use of shelter. We're not going to worry about these other characteristics for now. Let's just see if we can build a spreadsheet that will allow us to spot people that are kind of pretty consistently around all the time, and then let's see how well that works. Okay, so our silver medal solution then is we want to build a spreadsheet that will spot people that are making heavy use of shelter. But let's expand on that a little bit. So there's a few considerations. So in our spreadsheet, we're first of all going to have to find a way to quantify shelter use, right? We have to come up with some sort of number that represents how frequently somebody's using shelter. So we'll talk about how we're going to do that. We also don't want to sort of look at people too soon, because we know that, especially kind of in the first few weeks of shelter use, a lot of people will just simply leave shelter on their own. These are the so-called sort of temporary shelter users. This has been sort of observed at a lot of different shelters, especially in North America. And so we don't want to be in somebody's first week offering a really supportive housing solution necessarily, because that person might just sort of leave shelter on their own, which is really the result that we want. By the same token, we don't want to wait too long, right? So we don't want to wait too long and have somebody stay in shelter for a really long time before we see if they're at risk, because then it's kind of the old problem of, well, we've just spotted a long-term shelter user by waiting a long time. So there's sort of this sweet spot. We also want to make sure that we are only sort of looking at people who have used shelter recently. And this is kind of related to the second point as well, right? Like if somebody's just no longer around, we don't want to spend staff time kind of tracking them down. We only want to look at people who have, used shelter relatively recently. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of describe at a high level how we can use a spreadsheet to spot each one of these things. And this is maybe getting into a little bit of nerdy detail, but I've saved the the nerdy detail for the really nerdy detail for actually a different video. So first of all, how are we going to quantify shelter use? So what I'm going to propose, right? And remember, when you're sort of putting these data tools together, you're just trying ideas, right? So I'm not saying that these are necessarily the best ideas. You just got to start somewhere. So my proposal, where I propose to start, is we're going to quantify shelter use by calculating the percentage of days somebody has spent in shelter. So if somebody started using shelter 10 days ago, or if somebody first showed up in our data 10 days ago and they've stayed 5 nights in that 10-day window, then they would have a 50% shelter use percentage. So if somebody has stayed in shelter every single night since we first saw them in the data, they would have 100% shelter use percentage. And so the idea is the higher somebody's shelter use percentage, the more actively they're using shelter. So what about this business of don't look at somebody too soon, but don't wait too long? So we want to take a look at shelter records with our spreadsheet after most of our short-term sort of temporary people have left shelter on their own, but we want to look at them much sooner than most of the kind of traditional definitions of chronic homelessness, which are usually kind of on the order of a year. And so what I'm going to propose is we're going to look at people after their first 90 days in shelter, with the idea that most people who can leave on their own probably have left after 90 days. But 90 days is still a lot earlier than we've traditionally used to define or used as a definition for chronic homelessness. Again, just an idea, right? Why not 89 days? Why not 91 days? This is just something that we're starting with, and something we could adjust too if we weren't happy with our performance. We also want to focus on people who are still using shelter. We don't want to spend time trying to track down people that have already left. And so we're only going to review people in our spreadsheet who have used shelter at least once in the last 3 weeks. Okay, so now with those sort of high-level ideas in mind, we need to build a spreadsheet that can actually do this. This presentation is way too short to dive into all of those details. So what I've done is I've created a separate tutorial video. And so this is a QR code link to that tutorial video. I've got it just posted on YouTube. And in this video, I take 30 minutes and I actually, have a spreadsheet open on my computer in the video. And I basically sort of punch in all of the different spreadsheet commands necessary to actually build this thing. And I've got some links in that video also to other tutorial resources related to the different kinds of spreadsheet commands that I use. And this, this tutorial stuff, because I don't want to, leave this presentation with it's like, oh, good luck to you, build your spreadsheet. I want to actually show you all of the steps necessary to build the spreadsheet. There's also a link that you can download the spreadsheet if you want to. And, again, this isn't going to be for everybody, right? Not every person watching this video is going to want to or have necessarily the inclination to build a spreadsheet to analyze data. But my hope is that, if you're running a housing or homelessness agency, you probably have at least a few people in your organization that could do this, right? Again, maybe members of your IT group, if you're big enough to have an IT group, or just somebody, on your staff that just likes working with data. Maybe no formal training, but you know what? You don't need formal training these days to work with data. There's just so many good resources on the internet to sort of bootstrap yourself and, figure out how to do some of these things. And so all of those details are here. I'm not going to go into them in this presentation. What I want to do is just talk about how well our idea works, right? So did we actually win the silver medal with this spreadsheet idea? And so to evaluate this idea, I used a historical data set for about just over 28,000 people from the Calgary Drop-In Center between July 1st, 2009 and December 31st, 2019. And in that historical data set, I sort of label people as having, become long-term shelter users or not. And I use the Canadian federal definition of chronic homelessness to indicate whether or not somebody did or didn't eventually become a long-term shelter user. In my spreadsheet, everybody who meets the 90-day window criteria, who meets the we saw them 3 weeks ago criteria, if they had a shelter use percentage of greater than 50%, in the spreadsheet, it indicates them as at risk of eventually becoming chronic shelter users or long-term shelter users. Now, how do we assess how well this works? Well, in data analysis, we have a whole bunch of performance metrics, and I'm just going to use 2 of them here. So I'm going to talk to you in terms, or I'm going to present the recall and precision of our spreadsheet. Now, recall is basically the percentage of actual long-term shelter users that we successfully identify with our spreadsheet. So we've used the Canadian definition of homelessness to give sort of like the actual label of somebody who does or doesn't become a long-term shelter user. And let's say our spreadsheet identifies 50% of those people, right? So we identify half of them and we miss half of them. We would say we have a recall of 50%. So we were able to spot 50% of those people. Obviously, we want, ideally, a recall of 100%. We want our spreadsheet to identify everybody. Precision is a slightly more complicated, a little bit more complicated metric where we take a look at all the people that our spreadsheet identified as, at risk of becoming long-term shelter users and seeing what percentage of those people actually did become long-term shelter users. Because, we don't want to identify people who actually didn't eventually become a long-term shelter user, because then we might be allocating resources to people who didn't need them and maybe could have just exited shelter on their own. And so if we identify, let's say, 10 people with our spreadsheet who as at risk of becoming a long-term shelter user, and only 8 of those people in the historical data actually did become long-term shelter users, then we would say we have a precision of 80%. And so we also want a precision of 100%. Ideally, we want to have 100% of the people identified by our spreadsheet as actually eventually becoming long-term shelter users. And so if we evaluate our spreadsheet on this historical data set, this is our performance. So this is our silver medal solution. So our precision was 60.5%. And our recall was 52.5%. So again, what does this mean? It means that our spreadsheet successfully identified 60% of the total number of people who actually became long-term shelter users. So there was about 40% of long-term shelter users that we missed with the spreadsheet. The recall is 52.5%. So what does that mean? If we, let's say, identified 100 people as being at risk, about half of those people actually did become long-term shelter users. The other half didn't. And so Again, ideally we want both of these two numbers to be 100%. And this is quite a bit less than 100%. And so we can say, well, is this good enough? So if you were thinking about only using the spreadsheet to allocate housing resources, this performance would absolutely not be good enough. But I really want to emphasize that only using a technique like this as your only method to allocate housing resources would be a terrible idea. In my opinion, machine learning based, automatic data based methods for identifying at-risk people should never be the only criteria that is used to allocate housing. So this kind of spreadsheet should only be used in a housing program or a shelter ecosystem where you are engaging with people in a whole bunch of different ways, right? So you've maybe got a diversion team and you've got active conversations with people who are coming, people who are coming into your shelter. You've got, a case management team where you're having conversations with people and they're sort of self-identifying as having challenges that might make it difficult for them to exit shelter. They might say they need help managing an addiction, or they need help resolving a particular health concern, or they need help just managing landlord relationships. So all of this stuff needs to continue. This spreadsheet does not replace any of that. What the spreadsheet does is it's just a second, sort of easy to run tool that might potentially spot a few people that are falling through the cracks, right? So maybe, all of your other methods, you're engaging a group of people, you run this spreadsheet, you get a list of at-risk people. You might look at that list and say, oh yeah, there's 10 people on the list. We're talking to 9 of them, but there's a 10th person that you're not yet engaging with. And you might say, okay, well, let's take this 10th person and see if, one of your staff members can engage with them. And that's kind of the proper way to use these types of tools, just as sort of another tool for spotting people that you might want to engage with. And in that context, this performance actually isn't too bad, right? You're getting over half the people. Half the people you do identify as at risk might not be at risk, but if your mechanism is, as soon as someone is identified by this spreadsheet, to just refer them to a staff member, the conversation with the staff member will probably, pretty well identify who is really at need of, supportive housing resources and who isn't. So it's also interesting to compare. So I said at the start of the talk, AI is the gold medal solution. And so I actually used AI to solve this problem. So I took the same shelter access records, and I tried a bunch of different machine learning algorithms, and the machine learning algorithm that performed the best for me was, in this case, the random forest machine learning model. I used something called SMOTE oversampling to deal with imbalanced data. I used the balanced subsamples option in the random forest algorithm. So, I put some effort here, right? Like I tried to fine tune the algorithm a fair bit. And what did I end up with? A precision and a recall that's basically identical, maybe even a little bit worse than the spreadsheet. And so why is the performance not way better? Well, if there are machine learning, experts in the audience, and I'm sure there's probably at least a few of you, you can say, well, wait a minute, right? Machine learning, AI, excels when it's given a lot of different types of data to work with. You give it a lot of different sort of features. And so this business of identifying people who are at risk of chronic homelessness is actually a problem that's been considered a fair bit in the literature. This is kind of a common thing. There was a study done by some people in London, Ontario, Van Berlo was the primary author on this paper, and they used some pretty sophisticated machine learning to identify people who are at risk of becoming chronically homeless. And they have a bunch of results in their paper, but kind of the best they were able to get was a precision of 87% and a recall of 74%, right? So this is a lot better than I was able to get with my spreadsheet or my machine learning. But the reason why their machine learning solution performed better than mine is they used a lot more data, right? So rather than 90 days of data, they used 180 days of data. And they didn't just use shelter access entries. They use survey data from SPDATs and then a bunch of other information from London, Ontario's HIFIS system. And so they perform better, but they're also using a lot more data, which is more expensive, and they're using a lot more sophisticated tools, which is also expensive. So I would say Van Berlo is probably the gold medal solution. My machine learning, it's arguably, the bronze medal solution because we spent a bunch of money, but we didn't give it the input data it needed to really sort of get a performance increase. And so that's it, right? So we dove down into this kind of case study of, identifying people at risk of long-term shelter use. And now, for conclusions, I want to just step back. Again, the whole purpose of this talk was not to convince you to use this specific spreadsheet for this specific problem. In general, I just wanted to use this presentation to basically just say, you know what, you can do it. You don't necessarily need fancy AI or expensive experts. If you've got good questions and you've got some data in your agency, don't be afraid to just get your hands dirty and play around with some simple tools. Don't ever apologize for using spreadsheets. Spreadsheets are amazing. AI can often beat spreadsheets, but sometimes, you can answer your questions with simple tools and then just move on to doing the good work, right? And don't forget, the nerd you need might be right under your nose. This could be just somebody who's already at your agency, who already likes working with data, doesn't have formal training, but you don't need formal training because you can learn so much of this stuff on the internet these days. And then the final point is, humans are great, right? As we're talking about, this spotting people at risk of long-term shelter use, in our particular case study, AI and machine learning can be used to maybe spot people who are at risk of, a particular kind of outcome, like long-term shelter use. And this is just my opinion, you'll find people who have a different opinion, but in my opinion, AI and machine learning should never be used to automate frontline decision making. There should always be a human caseworker, staff person engaging with somebody who experiences homelessness, because healing happens in relationship. It's not that frontline staff are making bad decisions and somehow AI will magically give us new decisions that will solve homelessness. It's that the people who are working the front lines are often overwhelmed. They often don't have the information that they need at their fingertips. And so if we can use AI, machine learning, just data in general, to give frontline staff members better information, better context about the person that they're working with. For example, if this person might eventually be at risk of becoming a long-term shelter user, then it makes it easier for that person to, make a good recommendation for, what kind of supports are necessary. So AI data tools for supporting the human decision maker is absolutely a good idea. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation. More information on my website if you're interested. Thank you.